regardless of what speakers you have, regardless of what DSP you have. You can have the best speakers in the world facing you, but if they're reflecting right off of a hard surface, then you might as well just be listening to two cans on a string.
All right, almost Dr. Castro.
Yo.
Next question I got for you is, what are all the environmental factors, right? Room temperature, sound dampening, reflection, all these things that impact the way that a human being perceives the final audio signal from something like a speaker?
Oof, I mean, that's like basically the first half of my whole dissertation is what parameters are in play across the signal chain that ultimately yield to the perception of information. So just to kind of break it down from a high level, then I think we'll get down to, I think, the crux of this type of question. But at a high level, everything from the input to anything that happens to it along the way it's being transmitted to another medium, to the next box, to the next box, to the next box, to and from analog and digital, to the point where it actually gets transmitted out from a speaker or whatever is creating the sound, to the point where how you perceive it, to the point where if there's something wrong with the way you perceive sounds, to the way that you're using different modalities of your body. There's so many things that can alter what you're actually listening to, and it's pretty crazy. But one of the biggest ones that we know of is the reflections in a room, and that's why when you hear about studios, they say treating the room or doing something like that, right? It's also the difference why in a quiet room it sounds quiet because you're not hearing a lot of other things or a lot of small details in the room. Like an office setting, you can hear a lot of little tiny things, but usually only in your space. But if your office was in a giant concrete warehouse with no carpet floors and without the carpeted walls in between, then you're gonna notice a lot more. You're gonna have an overstimulation of signal. It's also why in the bathroom, it's harder to hear stuff distinctly, but you sound great when you sing, because you get all that reverb. So it's weird, but out of all the things that do make a big difference, if you're talking about acoustic transmission, because you have to rely on the air, and because there's things like air pressure, air density, air temperature, and also what quantity, or what's it called, the density of gases in the air also makes a big difference. A room full of nitrogen will transmit sound a lot different than a room full of oxygen, than a room full of CO2, etc. But let's say we're talking about a normal environment, then the biggest thing that's probably going to make the most difference, regardless of what speakers you have, regardless of what DSP you have, you can have the best speakers in the world facing you, but if they're reflecting right off of a hard surface, then you might as well just be listening to two cans on a string, because it's not going to make a difference. Obviously it'll make a difference, but it won't make that much of a difference because your room isn't treated, so the signal is interacting with so many other things by the time it gets to you.
So we have to really consider building an audio experience, not only which speakers you use, the quality of your input, but then after that, you're gonna have to start considering how is your room set up? Do you have to treat the room? How things are reflecting? Even the temperature, I understand, can potentially impact how you're hearing that sound and how that's being perceived.
Which is why studios spend almost almost as much as they spend on speakers. They spend almost that same amount on treating the room. It's that important.
And temperature control as well. Do they do a lot of? Do you know if?
Again, when you're near field, it deals a lot less. If you're in a big open field, then the transmission of sound is going to have a bigger impact. Speed of sound changes, altitude, air pressure, density. Because if you think about it, sound is really the transmission of the energy from one particle to the next in the air. So that's a phon, right? Just like there's a photon, there's a phon. And that basically shoots across all the air particles. So if there's more air particles, the air particles are more excited because there's more energy, hotter, then that's going to transfer a lot faster. So it's kind of crazy.
So, I mean, putting it into a simple context, which is not simple at all, if you are trying to design an audio experience and you have no background in audio, what would be some of your advice you'd give somebody to consider variables to kind of ensure a good enough experience? Once again, I mean, there's a lot of variables to consider there, but if you were to say like the top variables to consider that impact that final experience, what would they be?
Yeah, to give yourself a starting point, throw some bed sheets up. Throw something that covers as much of the hard surfaces in your room as possible. You're never going to get rid of everything. You're never going to get rid of this perfect acoustic environment. Even the top studios aren't necessarily perfect. There's just some sort of a level of acceptable response of the reflections in the room. So as long as you get to the point where you can at least start focusing more on the speakers than on the reflection of the speakers, then at least you've got a good point to start evaluating then the next step, which would in that case be the speaker system or the monitoring system that you have.
Got it. All right, a lot to consider, but audio sounds like it's a little bit more complicated than people think. Just buying a nice speaker doesn't necessarily yield the best audio experience.
Right.
Awesome.